Okie dokes. Great. Hello, hello, hello. Good afternoon. Good evening. Welcome welcome to today's weekly outlook. Today is the 6th of September, very close to the end of the year. And as usual, we're going to be covering volatility 75, volatility 50, and volatility 25, right? As you can see it down here, I am playing around with 75 1S at the moment, but not something that I'm looking to cover yet, nor is it something that I'm looking to trade. I'm just playing around with analysis on it and stuff and see how it moves because um, it seems to be an extremely sell bias market for the longest period of time. So it's a bit weird. It's a bit weird the way it works. But I'm just going to do a lot of back testing on it and see exactly how it moves, and then we can get down to perhaps trading that as well. I think it's actually the opposite of volatility 75 because if you go back on volatility 75, you'll notice that 75 is an extremely buy bias market, and then 75 1S is a sell bias market. So this could trade down like forever and just not give you a pullback perhaps until maybe what it took volatility 75, I think about 4 or 5 years for it to give for it to stop being a buy bias market, or it could go back to being a buy bias market as well. We don't know, but it's at all-time highs and it's been going up ever since like August 2017. So it could be the same thing with volatility 75 1S. It could be an extremely sell bias market and it could just keep creating new lows, keep creating new lows. So it's important to be very open-minded. If you are trading that at the moment, just be very open-minded about it, right? So without further ado, we're just going to get down to business today. And we're going to be covering the volatility 75 first as usual, then we go over to 50 and 25. Last week, I did cover our monthly and weekly outlook on all three of these indices. So I'm not really going to go into the monthly and weekly chart. Not much has changed in terms of my outlook of how it's going to play out, right? So I'm just going to stick with that, and then we're just going to go with the daily chart downwards and sort of set that precedent so you guys know exactly what I'm looking at on there. So looking at volatility 75, as you can see, my chart's all marked up today because I did notice that in a couple of the other sessions, there were a few things that I would have liked to point out, but unfortunately, it sort of slipped my mind on the session, so I didn't really point them out. So I said, today, let me just mark that chart up, as well as I don't want to have any distractions in between the session because it takes my mind away a bit. So I said, let me mark up the chart in advance today. So I actually spent a couple of hours before the session going through the charts, looking at everything in its entirety, and just refreshing what I'm looking at on there. So hopefully we're going to have a really, really good week going forward, or a good month per se, because everything seems to be moving quite well at the moment. So let's go with it, right? Looking at volatility 75, as you can see, not much has changed, right? On last week's session, I did touch on this little zone here that we've got, and you can see this zone is still playing a very vital role in terms of how price is moving. And however, we do have a bit of a confirmation that we might be seeing this market create new highs as we've got this little low that was formed here. We see price trading up from there, taking out this high over here that formed on the lower time frame. And we see price sort of spike down below these lows over here, but it did find a bit more liquidity to push it over to the upside. So it's going to be very interesting to see exactly what happens. But ultimately, I'm still seeing buys coming in on this market to in and around this area over here before we see price shoot back down. Now, what I would expect to see is, as usual, because we're not really retail traders and we're not looking to trade like retail traders, we're not going to look to just jump in at the trend line, because I will expect price to sort of wick above this trend line a little bit to just trick a few people into buys before we see this market splash back down. So worst case scenario, we'll be seeing this market drop from around this area over here, worst case scenario. But for now, I am still seeing at minimum a pushback into this zone, right? So we'll be watching very closely what price does over here. So you see some weak rejections over there. You see anything to that effect. I'm not sure exactly what strategies most of you guys use to trade, but dependent obviously on your strategy, if you see any confirmation of downward momentum from there, then it will be a good opportunity to take some buys from there and perhaps aim for in and around these areas over here, perhaps taking out this low again before we see price push back up to the upside. Ultimately, I think the big sell is going to come in from around there, which will see price reach down into this trend line and into this little blue zone that I've got highlighted over here. If you're curious as to what that zone is just simply support and resistance. What I actually did was I looked at the weekly and monthly charts, and I said, let me just identify some key levels of support and resistance. As you guys might have noticed, haven't really been focusing on that over the past couple of weeks. But I said, if it can give us a bit of an edge, then let's just use it. This is monthly support that we've seen down here, and you can see how critical this level is. And we have monthly resistance up here. Not really sure why that is not showing on this chart, but it's not really important at this point, right? Well, let me just go and show it. Let me see exactly what's the issue here. Oh, resistance. Not really sure why that's not showing at this point, but that's fine. I'll sort it out a bit later on. Okay, so ultimately I am seeing price coming down into this area, but not before we get a bit of a push to the upside to draw liquidity. This is something you're going to hear me talking about very often, because I believe that it is the energy that the market uses to move. And the only way to get that energy is, think about it. We've got a lot of guys that would have shorted from here, seeing that this is holding as a strong resistance. A lot of people would have taken the sell from here, perhaps aiming to take these lows over there, perhaps with a TP down here. All right, and then where would the logical place be for them to set their stop losses? Obviously, the logical place would be up in this area over here. So what price is essentially going to do is it's going to aim for those stop losses over there to take out all of those sellers, those early sellers who thought, okay, this market is now going to fall down because of all of the momentum that happened over here. It's going to take out those stop losses, trade a bit more to the upside perhaps, because what essentially then will form is, let me just clear that up. What will essentially form is a resistance becomes support. Once price trades above here, it will be resistance, and people will expect that resistance to now become support. So when price comes back down into this area, people will start buying, right? People will start taking buys, hoping to take this market up. And yes, it will push up, right? And then what will happen is the logical place to set your stop loss will be below here. People will set stop losses over there, and we'll see the market splash back down. So that's essentially why I use that term liquidity very often. There are quite a few people who do trade in a similar type of style, but not necessarily the same. So that is something that I do look at, just in case you're wondering, why is it that I always say buy lower than previous lows and sell higher than previous highs? Because I believe the market needs those liquidity drives in order to gain the momentum that it needs to move in the right direction, right? Going over to the H4 chart, not really much that we can point out on the H4 chart. As you can see, that overall we are developing a bit of an uptrend over here on this H4. We've got this lows that we identified on the daily chart, and inside of that trend, we've got this market making some higher lows over here as well. So what I'll be expecting to see on the H4 chart is a higher high to be formed before I see price come back down into this area and push up into there. Like I said on the daily chart, perhaps wick above this area, and then we'll see price splash back down again. Third touch of this trend line over here, which will lead to a slight bullish injection as well. It's important to be very open-minded. Even though your overall analysis is in a particular direction, you need to understand that interim in between your H4 setup, in between your daily setup, the market still needs to complete structure on your 15-minute chart. It still needs to complete structure on your 1-hour chart. So all of that is still going to happen, right? And just because that is happening does not necessarily negate your H4 setup or your daily setup. So being aware of what those structure changes can look like on a lower time frame will help you prepare a bit more. So like I said, a touch into there, push back up, a trend line touch down here, which will lead to perhaps a slight push to the upside before we see price push back to the downside, right? So ultimately, that's exactly what I'm looking to see. Just be wary of the fact, and I keep pointing it out, just be wary of the fact that we could see the market spike above this trend line over here, purely because it is the third touch into that trend line. So it could wick above that trend line just to give you a false breakout to the upside before it drops down, right? that is ultimately what I do see happening over here. Let's just go through the circumstances that would change this sort of outlook. The circumstances that would change this outlook is ultimately if we do see price trade above this area here specifically, right? And when I say trade above that area, what do I mean? I mean, we see price push all the way up, keep pushing, and perhaps retest into there and go up, then that would perhaps negate it, right? Anything below that, anything that happens below here will be still valid for us to see that long-term sell to the downside, right? Ultimately, this is the setup that I'm looking at, the daily setup, but in interim, in between that, you can get your lower time frame setups, which are in line with more or less what you expect to see on the bigger picture on the daily chart. Let's move on to volatility 50. Very simple straight setups that I've worked on this week. Nothing too complex, nothing too crazy. Everything in high probability of what I've gone through over the past couple of weeks. You'll notice that there's not really much change in what I'm looking at. And it's important to be consistent in your outlook as long as it makes sense. If it no longer makes sense, then it is very important for you to change that outlook or go back to your charts and change the way you were looking at it, right? Just one last thing that I wanted to just one last thing that I wanted to touch on before I get back to VIX 50 is I'm aiming for the market to come down here, but ultimately we're looking at this price going all the way back up. And you can notice that I've got this area marked here, which is something that I've been working on, or something that I've been back testing. And what I'm calling it is a price pocket, right? What it means is there's liquidity sitting at those levels, right? So there's liquidity, apologies for my doodling. There is liquidity sitting on that level. So what I'm calling it is a price pocket. And all it means is that I'm expecting to see price ultimately reach into this area to draw on the liquidity above there. So hence, we'll see something to that effect, push back up to there. Not really in that essence, but something to that effect to draw on the liquidity that's above here. Another thing is to touch on the fact that I did touch on the sessions last week that I am expecting to see price take out those weekly highs, expecting to see price take out those and create new monthly highs before I see price splash down. Not necessarily new monthly highs, but more take out the weekly and daily highs to create those new highs before we see price splash all the way back down, right? Now to move on to volatility 50. With volatility 50, this has played out basically almost down to the T as to what I've been saying over the past couple of weeks, or over the past week and a half to 2 weeks on volatility 50, which is I was expecting to see buys coming in from around this zone over here. And we have seen that happening. On last week's session, I did touch on this trend line here, which will lead to a bullish push to the upside. And as you can see, that also played out very well on the midweek catch up. And I'm not really sure if I touched on it on the weekly outlook, but I did touch on the fact that this zone over here will be the point to take profits for your buys, because price will most likely reject off that. And as you can see over here, price has rejected really well off that zone. So that's playing out pretty well, like pretty darn good. You know, if I could just make money from just sitting here and seeing where the market's gonna go, I would probably be like $1 millionaire by now. But unfortunately, I can't really do that. I need to sit on the charts and, you know, take these positions, which as a human being, you're gonna miss a few opportunities, you're gonna miss a few entries, and that's completely fine, because the market, as you can see, will give you opportunities as long as you know exactly what you're doing. So to speak about what I'm expecting to see going forward, overall, still buy bias on volatility 50. Now you can see that, I'm just going to zoom out a little bit so you can see this weekly sort of, I don't know whether you want to call it a rising pattern, or I don't know what you want to call it, but it's a bit of a channel that I identified, right? And you can see that we've got 1, 2, 3 touches off the bottom. We've got 1, 2 touches off the top. So essentially what I'm expecting to see is off this third touch here, I don't believe we're done with that bullish momentum sitting at that area. So let me just zoom back in, and you can see over here, I've got price pocket identified there. That means that ultimately I am expecting to see price come down into this area. Not immediately, but I am expecting it to, right? If you trade chart patterns, you know that a rising pattern like this as well is also a continuation pattern. So What it does is this is a bit of a corrective move, so you'll expect price to fill that corrective move and then break down into its actual move that it actually, or the trend that it was continuing in, or in the trend that developed prior to the correction phase developing, if that makes any sense, right? Let me just zoom back in so we can look a bit more in detail as to what we're expecting this week. So more or less what I am expecting to see this week is I'm expecting to see price come back into this area. As you can see that we do have a bit of a corrective structure that did develop over here, right, which is a bit of a falling wedge pattern, something to that effect. Not really sure about the terminology because I don't really trade these things, but I do use them to bring my attention to certain things. So I don't really, lose sight of it, but I'm not really trading it in the traditional sense of, when you see a breakout and all of that retest and all of those things. I'm trading it with the psychology of my strategy. And if it ties in with these little retail strategies or retail indicators or whatever, then all well and good. It gives me a bit more confidence for me to continue going in the direction that I'm going. So what I'm expecting to see here is I'm expecting to see price come back into this area, right? So you can see I've got a gray zone identified here at the bottom. So I'm expecting to see price come back into the zone. Should price come back into that area, then I will be looking to take buys back to the upside. And ultimately, I'm looking to take buys back into this zone. And should we keep going above this zone, looking to take it all the way up into this area over here. So that's my ultimate take profit. And then I'll be looking to see if we have a correction, and then we'll see if price pushes back down. But I am expecting to see price correct off that area and then push back to the downside, because ultimately on the higher time frame, we are still in a sell trend. This is just a minor correction, which sort of developed into a bit of a trend on the lower time frames. So it's a good opportunity to take intraday setups off that and take intraday positions or trades off that, right? So ultimately, we're looking for a pushback into there, pull back to the upside before we see price splash down. Perhaps give us a bit of a double top, with a bit of a high into this zone over here, this little blue zone that I've identified on the monthly and weekly chart. And then we'll see it splash back down to the downside. So ultimately, sell bias for the first 1 or 2 days of this week. And then we'll be switching back to our buy bias to take this market all the way back up. So a good opportunity to take a nice swing entry to the upside. Again, this is not confirmed. It's not definite. This is the highest probability based on how I look at the market. So feel free to do your own analysis. And should your analysis tie in with my analysis, then good days. You've got an indicator. You've got the amateur indicator, and you can use that to make some cash. Looking at the market from here, I did take a buy last week on VIX 50. I took a buy from somewhere around down here. It has nothing to do with the trendline retest. I know what you're thinking, trendline retest, support and resistance and all of those things. Not really, doesn't have anything to do with that. Purely based on the stuff that I look at, which I don't really cover on these sessions because, that's intellectual property stuff that I've worked on for a long period of time. It's stuff that I've put a lot of work into, so it's not really something I'm looking to give away for free. That buy that I took off this area, I did take profit in this area here because I was expecting to see its price splash back down. And as you can see, we had a bit of consolidation, and now we're seeing price trade back to the downside, right? So that is good. Ultimately, does support what we're looking at on the daily time frame. So that does support our buy setup for later on in the week. And, we'll be looking to see how that plays out. Not really much that I can point out on the H4 chart other than what we've touched on the daily chart. But we can perhaps draw a bit of a trend line over here as well, but it doesn't really make a difference because this trend line has essentially been broken. So it doesn't make a difference in my world, hence I haven't put it on there. Yeah, guys, that's pretty much it. So should price hold above this area here, I'll be looking to take those buys back to the upside. And should price not hold above this area, then it will be a good scalping opportunity we can take back to the downside. Not really something that you can hold for very long, because ultimately the highest probability for me is that the zone will hold. Even if price wicks into the zone, it will hold, and we'll see price trade back to the upside. Overall, buy bias on VIX 50. Let's go over to volatility 25. So this is kind of the black sheep of the family at the moment. Why do I say this is a black sheep? Because this shit has been giving me some false signals. Yes, we did get some good setups off here. I did take some good sell setups. As I touched on last week, I got some sells in on that correction. I've got some sells in on there, and I did get some sells in on here as well because I did point out on last week's session that we will see volatility 25 trade into the zone. If you go on to last week's session, you will see that I did touch on the fact that we will see a trade up. Should it hold? Should this candle? It was this specific candle over here. It was this specific candle over here. I said, if this candle closes bullish, um, yeah, if this candle, I believe it was this candle. Should this candle close bullish, or it could have been this candle before that, um, and it was trading down at the time. Not really sure exactly what it was, but I do remember pointing this out. And I did mention that we'll be looking at a breakout of there, and then we'll see the market trade back into the zone that I had highlighted in gray at the time. But as you can see on this chart, that I've still got that gray zone on there, and I've just added this blue zone, which is, like I mentioned, higher time frame into key levels of support and resistance, right? So that's just an additional confluence that reassures you that, hey, this could possibly go in that direction. So looking at volatility 25, just to explain exactly, let me not talk about the past and let's talk about what will happen going forward, because that's what we're all here for. As you can see, the market did create a nice higher low, higher low. It did break above this little consolidation phase that was happening over here, which is very well and good. On this pullback, what I was expecting, because I did identify that it will pull back from around here, what I will be expecting is to see this market trade back into the zone. Right? Should this market trade back into the zone, then it will be a good opportunity to take some sells to the downside. And ultimately, what we will be aiming for is these little zones over here. And as you can see, that ties in very well with this trend line that I've identified as well. Now, you might say, hey, that's not a valid trend line. Why is it so far from these lows? Why is it so far from that structure? But I draw my trend lines way different. I draw my trend lines based on where the trend starts, and I try to take the absolute wicks, because I believe that the wicks are the most powerful thing, and we always see the market trade back to test those wicks. So I tend to take it on the first two touches and then just drag it out. Whether it touches into other candles or not, ultimately I do expect the market to come back into this zone. So that's what we're looking at on there. A further push to the upside back into that zone, and then we'll take sales back down into here, and then we will see this market trade back up again into that zone, or perhaps into around here, before we see this market trade back to the downside to violate all of that structure. Just be very wary of the fact that we are still very, very bullish on the higher time frames. So the buys back to the upside will be very valid, right? Could push down to a little bit more, maybe wick back down a little bit more. But I think since we've got a full bullish candle close already, we should not see this market come back down, and it should continue just pushing back to the upside to take out this low over there before we see it coming back down to the downside, perhaps to around 50% of this move. See it push back to the upside and then come back down to around this area that I did identify. And then we'll see this market trade back again to in and around that area before we see it coming down. Now, this will give you like a bit of a double top type of setup, and that's where you'll see a good opportunity for you to take those sells that we've been waiting on for the past 4 weeks, and you will get a good opportunity to take those sells off that zone. And that's pretty much it. Not really much that I can touch on. 8-4 chart, I'm not really looking at doing any analysis on the 8-4 chart, because I do believe that all of these indices are sitting at really key levels in terms of their entirety or their overall moves, right? So the safest bet that you have right now is to do a really nice daily setup or really nice H4 setup if you're trading the H4 chart, and then just work off of that setup, because most likely what's going to happen is once you get a good setup on these charts, you're going to be able to trade these for the next, say, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, even up to about 2 months if you can get it at the right spot, right? So it's all about catching those key entries at the moment. So buy bias on volatility 50, sell bias on volatility 25, but for the earlier part of this week, we'll be pushing that up into this little gray zone that I've identified up there. And on VIX 75, we're still buy bias for the earlier part of this week. We want to see it testing back up into that area before we see it back to the downside, right? So that's it from my side, guys. It's been a pleasure as always to share. I'm just going to give you a few minutes for the guys that are on here. If you have any questions about these setups, any stuff that you want, you want to double check, and then I'll be done with the session.
Yo, my timing is so impeccable. Man. Um, will you by when will you have the Outlook uploaded, bro?
As usual, bro. Like I said, there's going to be a 1 day delay on the Outlook going up on YouTube. So I do the Outlook today. It will be up tomorrow at midnight.
Okay. No sweat. I think I'll just catch everything you guys went through on there then.
What I will do though is I will send out these setups on the premium group so that you
In
guys
the
have
group.
access to that, because I know I haven't been
Oh, that's
setting up
awesome.
my full Outlook for a while now, and I think I want to get back into the habit of doing that again. So I'll probably send that out, say tonight or tomorrow morning. I just want to see how these things play out because it's still fresh setups,
Yeah.
and then perhaps by tomorrow
Mhm.
morning I'll send all these setups out to you guys.
Okay, great, bro, great.
Stuff. Anything from your side, Mr.
No, just close the recording, then we continue, bro. Just close the recording.
Okay, cool. All right, then. That's it on this session for all you guys watching this on YouTube. I'm just going to give my guys a bit of personal attention. So that's it
You
from
know
my
what
side.
I mean?
Pleasure as always to share and enjoy.